the president of SpaceX? Got it, all right, very good. All right, so we will give you, well, actually, since you are the first one, which sticker would you like?
I'll go with the smaller
The
one.
JPL?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I
Thank
looked
you.
at JPL for most of my career, so there
yeah.
you go. All right, second question. How many countries have done in-space missile tests?
4.
Yes, and who are they?
US, China, India, Europe.
Russia, that's right, all right, congratulations. All right. I'm just glad you guys aren't Googling it. Sometimes people cheat and they start looking, and that defeats the purpose. All right, so what spacecraft is about to come back to the Earth with samples from an asteroid? Just finished its primary mission.
Is it Japanese?
Yes.
Hayabusa?
Yes. Hayabusa 2 actually, but I'll give it to you.
Yeah.
All right, and then let's see, for the last question, this one's a little bit more difficult, Evan. I'll give you a NASA Space Apps Challenge sticker and 2 chocolates. What would you say are the biggest contributors to disruptive growth in the commercial space sector? Give me one. The commercial space sector is growing very quickly, right, as compared to how it used to be. And so why is the sector growing as fast as it is right now? What's happened in terms of technology? CubeSats, yes. So miniaturization of technology, right? And then the other one is actually reusability, right? SpaceX now reuses their rockets, so they've dropped the cost by a factor of 5 at least for now. So what I want to do then is just go through some of these slides, and if you have any questions along the way, just go ahead and ask, right? Don't be shy. And this is one of our desktop models of a CubeSat that we use in our workshops. So some of you have seen this before. I'll pass it around. It's got all the components that a flight model might have, except for ADCS, which is the positioning, the attitude control. But it's used in terms of an education and training tool, so it's not the same quality. Obviously, we wouldn't just be passing it around like this if this had flight qualified hardware on it. So, okay, so space entrepreneurship and you, how astropreneurship will change the global economy. And this is real, so it's really cool talking to an audience like this because you guys have already drunk the Kool-Aid. You already believe in space, and if I say to you that we will have space tourism in the next few years, you don't look at me like I'm crazy. You know that there's some activity and that this is really gonna happen. And I mean, in your lifetimes, you guys will be space tourists, right? There's no doubt. By the time you get to be my age in 30 years, you'll definitely have opportunities to go into space for about the price of a first-class plane ticket, which is, you know, accessible. So we talk about why we want to get involved in space. So if you are an investor, since we're talking about astropreneurship here, we need to look at it from the perspective of somebody who would put money into the sector. When you look back at the Earth, you actually see a global economy as a single market, right? Everything that we are doing to provide, you know, services and information for Earth is for a global market. People no longer choose just to beam data back to their own country. I mean, the governments might do that for military purposes, but in the commercial sector, what you have, you sell and you provide on a global level. And every resource that we've ever had on Earth actually exists out there, right? Because you know all the elements are formed in stars, and asteroids have a lot of this material, and asteroids are worth trillions of dollars, so there's a lot of interest in mining. So we would not have to deal with wars or ecological issues like mining creates a lot of pollution. And legacy claims, now that one, that's a little tricky because space law is kind of up and coming, and we talked about the missile tests in space. So yeah, you can explode your own missile, but you're creating thousands of pieces of space junk that hit everybody else. So who owns what are the rules? That's all got to be figured out. And international cooperation and globalization are really important, and I think they will drive the new space age. And plus, there's no gravity, which makes it a really unique platform. There's stuff you can do in space that you can't do here. So just to get a sense of where you guys are, how much of this is new information? Or do you already know this? Because sometimes people are completely new to this. You guys kind of sort of, I'm looking at your faces and it seems like you have a general sense of all of this stuff, right? Okay, well that's helpful to know. All right, so what's my point here? This, as you know, is Photoshop. Singapore has not been to Mars. But the whole point here is we've got our phones. We're continuously engaged with space, hundreds of times a day, thousands of times a day, just depending on how much you're using your location-based services. And we're about to transition from space being just your location services to a very exploratory kind of huge economy, which will eventually result in things like people going to Mars from, not just the major spacefaring nations, but from all countries. So we've had in the past decades billions of dollars spent on projects. So NASA, of course, you get some of those stickers. My first job out of college was on the Hubble Space Telescope, which cost $2 billion to build. And then they had an issue with the mirror. It was launched in 1990. And the mirror actually had the equation was backwards in one of the signs, so the curvature was wrong. It had basically an astigmatism. So the light would not focus, it would come down to a sort of a blur of multiple points. And so it was basically, unless you used a spectrograph, it was kind of useless because the images were blurry. I happened to work on a spectrograph. So for me, that was good. So what that meant was we just had to increase our exposure times to get the same signal through. So it was actually job security. But what ended up happening is NASA went in and they had to put a pair of corrective lenses inside, and because the Hubble was at 400 kilometers altitude, astronauts could get into it, they pulled out some of the old instruments and stuck in new ones, and they actually ended up pulling out the spectrograph that I was working on. But that spectrograph had 16K of memory on board. It had diodes. Do you guys know what diodes are? You studied diodes? Yeah. So that's how old it was. It was built in the 70s. And then it was supposed to go up on the Challenger, and then the Challenger shuttle exploded. So NASA put the whole program on hold, and basically the Hubble sat in a clean room at Goddard Space Flight Center, NASA, in Maryland, and we would turn it on every few months, see what was going on, what worked, what didn't. I literally kept track of the dead diodes, and then we would just sort of average across the pixels for the calibration. And so then eventually they did launch it, but by the time it launched, some of the tech was old. So anyway, they pulled out the spectrograph and they put in this corrective optics plane with some other instruments. So another one that I worked on, since I told you I started actually in 1989 on the Hubble, so 30 years. Galileo spacecraft is actually my favorite because I did my PhD with Galileo. In situ measurements of plasma and magnetic fields around Jupiter. It's a very harsh radiation environment, so I've always loved Jupiter ever since I was a kid, so it's kind of cool that I got to work on one when I got older. So this is from the Hubble. I am back here. This is like just a few weeks before the Hubble launched, actually. This guy here, Riccardo Giacconi, eventually won the Nobel Prize for radio astronomy. His office was around the corner from mine. Back then, I didn't really know who he was. I was just scared because he had a very loud voice. And every time you walk by, I would just look very busy. It was my first job out of college, make sure I looked good. But you can see the number of people that were working on this. And this was maybe 1/10 of the total population. And the other thing you can see here, which is a little bit different today, is it was mostly white dudes, right? That's just the way it was back then. And I think I was actually the only woman of color. We had some people on the admin staff, but that was kind of it. And then eventually we got a postdoc from India, so everybody was like, oh, we're so diverse now. But it's very different now. All right, so today we're not spending billions, but we are doing it on the order of tens of millions, and everybody knows about Chandrayaan going to the moon recently. So that one, I actually, let me see here. There we go. All right, so Chandrayaan 2, I actually live commentated for the BBC, which was not a lot of fun because you can imagine they have the control room and they've got my face there, and you know, they had said, just tell us what's going on, just explain what they're thinking. And I see the faces, right? And you know, I don't know if you guys remember that plot of the descent curve. It goes vertical. I was just like, oh my God, what am I gonna say here? And then what is Prime Minister Modi thinking? I'm just like, it's weird to be asked that kind of a question, but I'm thinking, I know he doesn't know what's going on, so I'm just gonna have to tell him. But anyway, so it crash landed, did not land as it was supposed to. Same as the Israeli spacecraft that crash landed. But the thing is, no technology development like this goes wasted. They took some pretty high definition images of the moon with the orbiter, And right now, one of the instruments on the orbiter is measuring solar flares. It has that capacity, so they're actually using it to do something else that's quite interesting and useful. So Gwen Shotwell, you mentioned her. She's talking about putting a Starship in orbit next year to have it land on the moon before 2022 with cargo. So here we are, November of 2019. They're talking about doing this in 3 years, right? And so this stuff is not crazy. And I'm not talking specifically about large companies, I'm talking about small ones as well. I mean, these guys are funded through, Elon's empire, and they do a lot of stuff which really drives the sector. So while, they're getting the billions, everybody who's underneath of them, all the suppliers and everybody else is really able to step in now and come up with new technologies and just build a supply chain, really. And it's not just like an instrumental supply chain, it's really a knowledge supply chain. So we're at the point now where CubeSats cost $300,000 to put into orbit. There it is over there. You guys, has everybody had a chance to see it? Yeah, okay. So it's $300,000 and you can put it into orbit. And this one doesn't have the attitude control, like I said. It's got a very basic camera on it. We ordered the parts from China, had them assemble the boards. So the subsystems on here are pretty much what you would have if you were to actually build a spacecraft. So it's a kind of, it's a simulation teaching tool, but it's kind of cool. So then the other thing is in Singapore right now, we have students sending experiments to the International Space Station for about $65,000 Sing dollars. Think about that. Imagine being like 16, 17 years old. I would have loved it in that day. Being able to build something on schedule, send it for approval for NASA, and have astronauts work on it and install it for you on the space station. So when you came to see the astronaut, I don't remember where you exactly saw him in 2017, Jeff Williams, he actually was one of those astronauts who would plug in experiments, and they don't just do it for the students have these little boxes. They run experiments, across everything from animal and plant growth to machining and manufacturing. There's a 3D printer now in space. And that's a startup actually made in space that's building more and more things up there. And what they're doing is kind of finding some cool effects of physics. So when you don't have gravity, other forces start to dominate. So surface tension between the material that's being layered and the base of the printer itself, that surface tension becomes really strong because there is no gravity to sort of mess with it. And so they have to actually figure out how to pry it off. And this is the kind of technology they would never have, thought about. This is the kind of issue they would never have thought about unless they were actually up there, right? So internationally, we're taking images of the Earth every day, once a day now. Does everybody know about Planet Labs? So it's so cool to talk to an audience where people have heard of so much of this stuff. I don't have to explain about this. So they're taking images of forests and agricultural areas and construction. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring up this particular set of images is we are in a global ecosystem now. So you don't just need the tech. I mean, I love the tech, you love the tech. We're very interested in the hardware and the software and the systems. But if we are going to actually build an ecosystem, we need much more than that. We need people who understand law, as we said, social issues, cultural issues, all kinds of real human issues like anthropology would also be important to be able to implement this. So you can get the images of the forests in Indonesia, figure out where they're burning, then we in Singapore are choking, we're telling them, please, stop your fires. But if you're a farmer in Indonesia and they ask you to stop clear cutting your land, you have to feed your family. What are you gonna do? Right, so we keep pushing tech, we keep thinking about how we really want people to save the forests and save our lungs. Somebody's gonna have to come up with some kind of a social policy to provide these guys with an alternative, guys or girls. Clean energy, maybe they could replace what they're doing now with some kind of solar panel system to actually provide clean water for their own local area. But so somebody's gonna have to figure that one out, and we're not taking that next step right now. So in terms of startups, I think these kinds of things I'm going to discuss on this slide are very interesting because it leads you to a whole realm of services specifically to promote the use and adoption of space tech, right? So that's the next step I think we have to take to be able to move forward. So we've talked about the miniaturization of electronics, we've talked about reusability. So all the tech is basically there, but for us to get from there to, you know, the biggest ecosystem the planet's ever had, which I think will happen, we're gonna have to figure all this stuff out. So in terms of construction, this is in New Zealand, you know, they can do time lapses of construction now, right? Then you can monitor your supply chain and do all that. So they were concerned in New Zealand on the North Island about overdevelopment. And so they kept sending these images, these are all from Planet Labs, they kept sending these images to various people in the government and, you know, saying, oh, this shouldn't be happening. But nobody cared until they sent it to the indigenous people. They're not the Maori, it's another tribe whose name I can't remember. But it's their land, there are restrictions, and so what they would do is they would get the images and go see, is this an allowable area for this construction to happen? They cared, so giving them the data, thinking about it, giving it to the people who actually would make use of it for benefit was really important. So they had to make connections there, not just with the government, but with the tribal leaders locally to tell them, you know, this is your area, figure out if this is where the construction should be happening. And then this is farms in South Africa. So the deal there is you can use GPS with your farming equipment, you can get better yields, you can use images to figure out when your crops are gonna ripen. But if I'm a farmer and I'm a subsistence farmer, all I do is grow enough material, enough crops to feed my family, then you have to convince me that I have to get some kind of an app and pay for data regarding my crops, right? I have my phone, and you have to tell me why it's worth it for me. So we can put in the GPS system, we can put in, Elon Musk can put in his 40,000 or whatever that number is, satellites he's gonna put in to provide global internet. We can do all that, we can provide high resolution, high cadence images, but until you can convince the customer, the subsistence farmer who doesn't have a lot of money, that it's beneficial to him, then you're not gonna get anywhere. And the argument there is fairly straightforward, right? Because if you just do a little bit of reading, you realize 40% of crops don't make it to market, they spoil. 40%, that's huge. And the simple reason they don't make it is because there's no transport. So a farmer has to book a truck and have the truck take his stuff to market. So there's traffic, there's also mistiming of when the crops ripen. And you know, remember with climate change now, all models of weather are off. You can no longer average like the past 5 years and say, okay, I assume my wheat crop will be ready within this period of time. So if you can take images like this, like you can do what's known as hyperspectral imaging, you know, taking many, many wavebands, then you can actually figure out when the crops are going to be ready, and you can book your truck accordingly, and you can even go in and sort of share that with other farmers to be able to reduce your costs. So what's happening here? Technical glitch, nothing a little bit of calibration can't fix. All right, yeah, come back. Okay, cool. All right. So access to space is democratized. We've talked about farming. We've talked about a lot about imagery. So there's some other really interesting things that happen in space uniquely. Do you guys know? Has anybody heard of pharmaceutical development in space? So, okay, so one of you's heard about it. So in micro-G, you can grow protein crystals that look like the ones on your right. If you grow crystals of protein on the Earth, they look like the jumbled ones on the left. Now, why is this important? Pharmacists and doctors will model medication, model them on computers, right? And some of these can be really long chains. You can't build them on the Earth because the pull of Earth's gravity will break them apart. They can't last here. So if you can build them in space, you can actually build something that will be stable and then build around it and sort of stabilize it with the other chemical compounds and then bring it down to Earth and do some drug manufacturing. So right now it's quite expensive, but you know, the more we do this kind of thing, the more you can do, you know, the more you can sort of industrialize it. We had some students from one of our client schools actually do protein crystallization in space last year. So they actually, it was an interesting thing for them, and they're high school kids, right? So it wasn't as rigorous as it should have been, but they wanted to get their solution, so it's just on the brink of crystallization, so they had to have enough material in there. But then, you know, if you shake it, sometimes they'll form crystals. What happens at launch? So they, you know, they're young, they hadn't thought it through. The tubes got hardened crystals in them from the jostling, and they got some images, but it's not clear whether the crystals are formed on the ground during launch or later. But anyway, for them, that whole process is just like with Chandrayaan. Even if it doesn't work 100%, there's so much you can get out of it. The most important thing for those kids was they went from being these sort of teenagers chasing that next shiny object to this organized, coordinated group that delivered stuff on time. Because what happens if you don't deliver? They'll just go up without you, right? They're not going to wait for a group of students to deliver a tiny little 1/4 of you. So their payload is actually 1/4 this size of one of these CubeSats. That's a standard student payload for this project. So the other thing is this drug called Prolia. If you know anybody who's elderly that has bone loss, this happens particularly to women as they get older. You know, sometimes you see their grandmas sort of walking like this. Astronauts also have bone loss in space because there's no load on their skeletal frame. So they had this drug that they had prepared. This is a company called Amgen, major pharmaceutical company. They decided they wanted to do their animal trials in space. What you do on Earth is you induce bone loss in mice, and then you test the drug on them, and then you kind of look at the effects. But that is expensive, and it takes a long time. They sent some mice up there, and so the mice lost their bone mass very quickly, and then they injected them. If you want to do something really fun, look up on YouTube mice in space. It's hilarious. They start tumbling, and then they figure it out very quickly. It's really, really funny to watch them. But they put them in a cage, and they're basically just sort of floating around looking very confused, and then they figure out they can clutch onto the side of the cage and start running. It's pretty funny. Anyway, so they were able to shorten their clinical trial there, I think, by months, if not a couple years, and they're making $780 million a quarter. Okay, $780 million a quarter on this drug globally. So if you save them even like a month, that's going to be 1/3 of that, right? It's huge, the amount of money that they can save. So they put money into the space station work, but it was well worth it. So democratized access does mean that we have access to the space station. So on the left there is a tooth that the students from our Australia client sent up last year. There was a kid that actually lost 2 teeth at once, so they had one for the control and one for space. And then they introduced bacteria, and then they just looked at the rate of decay, because bacteria behaves very differently in space than it does here. And this is an important area for startups in terms of vaccines and pharmaceuticals, because we don't quite understand why, but certain species of bacteria do very, very well in space. And this really is like a very toxic strain of E. coli that we have here. Will thrive in space. It's okay here, but it thrives up there very effectively. So if you want to think about space medicine and vaccine development, doing these experiments in space, which you can do right now, there are platforms up there. If you want to do something like that, it's already possible. Just got to find somebody to work with you who has a medical background, which again is an interdisciplinary thing that we just talked about. So the other thing is CubeSats on the bottom right here. I think that's a team from Finland. They were doing spectroscopy. And so what I wanted to show you in the pie chart on the left, can I turn off the slide? Does anybody know where to switch that with me? So the pie chart on the left is the number of the kinds of CubeSat missions that are going up right now. And the green right there, you can see, that's the education sector. So that's about 12%, it says. So that's a substantial number, right? So they're not just putting in all the military and the commercial stuff, they're actually doing a lot with students as well. And if you look at the number of CubeSats launched, this is a function of time on the x-axis. I think I started with year 2003 and it went up to 2000. This was earlier this year, so 2019 isn't completed. We did have a drop in there because I don't know if you know, in 2014 there was an orbital rocket that exploded. The Antares exploded. It had a bunch of CubeSats on it, including one from NUS, which had an experiment from the CQT lab, which they found the whole box on a beach in Florida like months later, and the box was still alive. So they brought it back to the lab and they actually were able to turn it on and check it, which is pretty cool. If I ever have anybody build my electronics, it's gonna be those guys. It's pretty cool. All right, so global new space economy. There are about 2,400 startups globally now. This number changes all the time. This is from a database that I have access to. And you can see all the different areas where these startups are working. They're obviously North America and Europe are the places where we've traditionally had focus, and we still do. But I actually see this as an opportunity because on this side of the planet, there are 5 billion of us, right? So there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of talent, there's a lot of capacity. We just have to start thinking about doing what we're doing. And now that the prices are so much lower, you don't have to have $1 billion to get involved in any of these. So this is actually a really cool database. Let me see if I can, I kept the web page up for this because I didn't know if I'd have Wi-Fi. There's a database called NewSpace HUB. This is started by my friend who works at SpaceX. That's his day job. I don't know how he finds time to do this at night, but this is what he's done. So you can go in and query anything, like I had said Singapore, and then there's a list here, you know, Spectral, that's the CQT, lab, their spin-off, and they've got all these other companies that are listed here. And people contribute to this. He's got a team of people that contribute. So you can go in and do a search here for, like if you want to do a startup, you want to know who else is working in the area of power systems, for example. You could go in here and just look that up and see who else is doing in the world, and that at least gives you a starting point to look at their websites. And it gives you an option to, you know, you can just go start the discussion with people there, you know, do the LinkedIn thing and whatever. So we go over this in more detail. We have a workshop coming up on November 2nd. We have 2 workshops coming up. So we're gonna work with this database during the Astropreneurship workshop. So if you wanna come and figure out how to do that, you can. And at the workshop, I'll be giving out access information because I've got some passwords from this guy I can give to people. So you can, I think at this point, you guys are students too, he'll just give it to you for free. But it's actually really interesting because you can, it used to be 2,339 as of last time I pulled the data. That's a lot, right? Those are live companies too, defined as live, and we may have missed a bunch of them too. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the slides.
Which of these segments is very popular at the moment?
Rockets are really popular. I mean, define
Launch.
popular. As in like getting a lot of media, doing a lot of stuff. I mean,
Maybe which segment has the most number of startups?
I could look that up actually. I don't know. It goes back and forth time to time. And you know how these are categorized also can vary. CubeSats are hot. CubeSat related systems are hot. People are really into rockets right now because you know we've had we talked about what enables space today, right? At the beginning, we talked about the miniaturization of electronics, the CubeSats, and then we talked about just the whole sector as a whole, reusing components. But what's really interesting here is there are a couple bottlenecks which are being actively addressed. One of the bottlenecks has been launch spots because you have so many CubeSats now, and people are waiting like 2 or 3 years to launch, which means a couple things. One, it means you're wasting time. If you've got a startup, what are you gonna do between today and 18 months from now to keep your team going? And the second thing is, remember what I said about the Hubble and old electronics? Well, electronics are aging even more quickly now. You think about the camera on your phone today versus the, I don't know, iPhone, whatever, you know, like a year ago even, the camera wouldn't have been as good. So, you know, if you've got an iPhone 11, you've got what, the 3 cameras? I don't know why you need 3, but anyway. So, you know, it's just moving forward very quickly. So if you have a CubeSat that's in the queue forever, that will delay you substantially. So, yeah, so that launch is being directly addressed, but you know, that's a good question. We can look that up. I'm kind of curious right now. All right, so then we talked about space tech as a sector, and then we were talking about the actual tech, but I think there are the other issues in terms of you know, the people factors that have to be incorporated into businesses and services and employment, usefulness, and actually dealing with the stakeholders. And so I would say we need social, economic, finance, and law, which we mentioned, marketing, definitely for your products, education, medicine, and there are probably a host of other sectors that you could think of that need to be drawn in to make it into a true ecosystem, not just a place that techie people go to satisfy their curiosity or their passion. So this is where I really want to make a call to action to you guys to think about, you know, finding people to work with in these sectors so you can come up with your own ideas. Oops, sorry, repeat. So the reason I decided I wanted to talk to you guys today is we are really at the place now where computers were in the 70s. So, you know, the 1970s, you had these big, ugly, slow terminal with one line across the screen. It's one screen, and then by the time it was the mid-80s, this is probably before many of you were born, everybody had the Macintosh, like you had one at school or you had one in your home. And this was, within a decade, you went from these, $100,000 pieces of equipment to something that cost $1,000 or maybe $2,000 that you could actually have in your home. And so we're at that point right now with space tech. It's just on your phone now for GPS. But as these satellites get launched and as more technology develops, there will be use cases that we can't imagine now. And this is where you guys come in, because I am middle-aged. I'm very much what my husband likes to call a linear thinker, right? And I used to be non-linear back in the day when I worked on the Hubble, but now I'm sort of at a point where I can't think like you guys do in terms of new ideas and innovations. So, for example, Google Maps. When I was in the 1980s, like when I was working on the Hubble in the 90s, we would have paper maps that everybody kept in your glove compartment, and you would share those with your friends if somebody was going on a trip. And if somebody had said, I'm gonna take this map here and put it on something that fits in the palm of your hand, I would have said, are you kidding me? I don't want that, that's useless, I can't do that. And here we are, we can't live without our maps, right? So we're in this world using a service, hundreds of times a day you get pinged in terms of your location, and it would have been absolutely unimaginable back in 20, 25 years ago. So whatever is going on now in terms of space tech, you guys will find use cases for it that I have yet to see, that you guys will figure out. And I think that's really exciting. So let's just talk about some global effort right now. The PSLV rideshare, they sent up 21 spacecraft. So the PSLV, if you don't know, is India's basically their workhorse that sends things to low Earth orbit. They have had, I think, 46 launches now. They've been pretty flawless. It's been kind of amazing. They dropped the cost significantly from everybody else. This one was a partnership between the US and India, and then the Falcon 9 launched. We talked about the moon missions. They were the ones that launched the spacecraft to the moon to get it up there. The Bidushi mission from Israel as well. And then upcoming missions, they're going to send up a bunch. Spire is another startup that's here in Singapore. Well, they're not a startup anymore, but they have a bunch of satellites on both of these upcoming missions to go up in November and December. So rocket launches are happening all the time, which means we're getting tons of data. So far in 2019, we've had 75 launches. This is the kind of thing that used to happen once or twice a year. And this is global, so these are the countries that are launching: China, EU, India, Iran. Theirs didn't do so well. Japan, Russia, and the US. And then I've listed just some of the countries down below that actually have sent payloads up. You see Singapore, Sri Lanka, that flag on the right is Nepal. I think that's a really cool one. Cyprus is that little island with the white background there. Kazakhstan is the turquoise colored one, and then you've got the Middle Eastern, the UAE, and so on, Luxembourg. So it's a global thing now. I think, so you've got 184 countries in this world. More than half of them now have satellites. They may not have built them, but they have launched them in their own interest, and it's primarily for broadband and telecommunication. But, well, here's another interesting question. What country was the first one to provide TV signals from space, beamed up and beamed back down? What country first made use of that? Does anybody have an idea?
The Soviets?
No, US, Soviets, no, keep going.
Japan?
It was in the 1960s, not Japan. They do a lot of stuff in space now, so.
India?
Yes. You already got a chocolate, I'll give you some. Yeah, so in the 1960s, they actually used some of these telescope satellites to beam, so to be able to beam the signals to these remote villages, and it was this sort of, let's give it a try kind of thing. It was literally a university professor in India and some professor in the US that did this, but that sort of set the way for global access to information. So I was kind of surprised it was that early 60s, but it was. All right, so since we're talking about Singapore, Spire is a CubeSat company. They build 3U, so that's one of these guys here, times 3. They don't sell themselves as a satellite company. They sell themselves as a data company. So what they do is they take images, they don't take images, they monitor ships, they take the signal that ships are transmitting to figure out where they are, and they also do some weather monitoring. And they just got a Series D. I don't know, how familiar are you guys with entrepreneurship. Does anybody know when I say Series D? If you don't know, don't be shy. So, okay, so you don't know? Or you do?
No.
Okay.
I have no
So,
idea.
all right, so when you have a startup, you can either go all the way through with your own money, your own revenue, and not take on investors. But if you're gonna take on investors, they come on at certain stages. And typically you ask for more money as you get further along. So when you're in the seed stage, that's the very early on stage, you might have an idea or just a basic product. And that, gosh, these days in space, it can be $500,000 up to $2 million. It really depends on the sector. But you get that, and then people take shares of your company, and then they theoretically provide you with advice to help you get to the next stage. So then you've got a product, you want to go on. Series A is your bigger injection of money, A, B, C, D. So these guys, and SpaceX, just parenthetically, is at like Series H now, but they just got like another $1 billion. So those are many, many zeros more than we're talking about here. Spire just got their $30 million for a Series D. They've had $150 million investments in total. Their global headquarters is here in Singapore. Astroscale is a Japanese company with global headquarters here, and they do space debris mitigation. They just had their $40 million Series D round, and they've gotten $160 million in total, and they're talking about IPO. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, IPO is Spire, not Astroscale, so I'm gonna have to fix that. IPO is when you go A, B, C, D, whatever, and eventually you get to the point where you put yourself on the stock market, and anybody can come and buy shares of stock, and that's just, you're basically a publicly traded company at that point, and that's the ultimate in terms of bringing in funding. And that's basically, you've made it. So that means you're like Coca-Cola or Apple, right? And so Spire is sort of toying with that idea, if you read the rumor mills correctly.
I have a quick question. How is it that these guys have a much bigger total fund that they have raised? When you go down the series A, B, C, D, you get more and more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, let's say Astroscale started at 40 million, but
The
then total
Series D is
so much
40
more.
million.
It just means the more value, the value is higher.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Series D is 40 million. Their C may have been 30 something.
Mm-hmm.
And
If you add up
cumulatively, yeah.
right, if you add up 40 all 4 times, it's just 160.
Well, they get multiple injections too, so I guess you could say A prime. I don't know, but each round of raising, and you can even over raise. Like Series A seed would be your first, Series A would be the second, and so on. So you can, and if a company's hot, and okay, Astroscale hasn't like done anything. They haven't launched anything that's actually gotten data yet. So here I sit with my CubeSats actually generating revenue, and I don't know how they do it, but they've got the backing of SoftBank. So that gives them a lot of credibility.
They launched, the first launch failed at Astroscale.
They what?
Their first launch they failed. I mean, they lost
The payload?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were supposed to get, they were supposed to send up a surveying spacecraft to look at micro debris and do some kind of survey, which I think that would be an interesting problem to address. But anyway, so they're not IPO at Spire, but 160 million total so far. So the new space economy, these are reports that come out quarterly. If you follow the sector, which I hope you guys do from now on, you can actually see what's going on. So the total global space economy is about 350 billion right now. This was actually in 2018. And so satellite services, that include broadband telecommunication, basically that's the biggest sector. On the top left there, that grayed out area, that is basically the government budgets, majority of that is. Commercial space flight is still growing. And then the ground equipment to support all that. You have to send your data and your signals back down to the ground. That's another significant chunk of that industry. So in the new space economy, we talk about commercial space, we call it new space. There are a number of sectors where we think there's going to be significant progress. And this report was put out by Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. And they talk about, it's just put out in 2017, but it's still pretty valid. They talk about where they think as investors, as finance people, that the sector is going to go, because they actually have some investments in some of these companies in these sectors. So I had said half the world, so 80 plus countries have satellites in space. That was 2017, that number's higher now. 16 billion has been invested in space startups. That number again is going to be higher at this point. And when they look at the number of billionaires who've invested, it's 16 out of 500. And 16 is a lot. If you're a billionaire, that's a lot of money. But I think what that tells you is this sector is part of the passion of people who have the means. So everybody here is not gonna become best friends with a billionaire, but the fact is the global trend is towards doing all these, really big things, big picture things that are gonna need support from people like us. So, when Elon Musk launched his Tesla, remember when he put his Tesla into space? I can't tell you how many people, my office is over at Block 79. I can't tell you how many people came up to me that day. Did you see the thing that Elon did? They were just like so thrilled. It really got the public imagination going. So it was kind of a stunt. It was silly for him to do, but for the space economy, for us startups, it's really good publicity because stuff like that makes space real to the average person who doesn't think much about it, right? So these are the number of missions to Mars that are coming up. All that's very real. And if you look at the actual trend, this is from Morgan Stanley from a separate report. Look at the growth that they're predicting through the 2020-40 in terms of space sector. The green area grows the most, and that's going to be second order impacts, which basically means space related services, data services, the future version of Google Map, whatever that ends up being. All of that's going to grow very quickly. But you are going to see, this is trillions of dollars on the y-axis there, but you are going to see growth in ground equipment and hardware and as we keep going. The whole economy is going to start building more and more services on top of basically the infrastructure that we are building at this time. So we're in October of 2020. Here's the stuff that's going to happen in the next year. Even if you don't believe these numbers literally, it's 1 or 2 years away, right? It's not going to be like in 2040. So SpaceX, the Dragon, Falcon 9, they're going to start sending commercial crews to the International Space Station. Remember how we talked about the astronauts up there? The only people who've been able to send people to space since US stopped doing it are the Russians. So the Russians, the Soyuz, they've been the only people capable of sending anybody to space for quite some time now. And so both SpaceX and Boeing have contracts for commercial crew vehicles to go up there. And they'll autonomously dock. Now, SpaceX has already done this with the Dragon, basically the same one that they are going to send up. And they're going to reuse these too. Like, this is the other really cool thing. So they've already sent it up with cargo and docked it. And so they're talking about sending up commercial crews already. And Boeing is doing the same thing with its Starliner capsule and Atlas V rocket. Virgin Galactic, they, remember how I talked about going IPO, going into the stock market? Virgin did that Monday, this week. They just went public. So their valuation went up by I don't know how much at that point, but basically now Richard Branson has decided that Virgin can sell its shares to anybody, so anybody can become a part owner and in the company. And so now space tourism is a publicly traded commodity. Think about that. That's kind of crazy to me. And I would have, satellites, yes, people do, and all kinds of other stuff, but space tourism. So he's predicting he's saying $250,000 ride to the moon next year. You think about how much a car costs in Singapore, right? That is not a crazy number. I mean, it's still not accessible to most of us, but this is all happening. And Rocket Lab, they're a company in New Zealand and also in the US. They have an Electron rocket that they will be sending to the moon, they're saying in 2020 as well. So people are breaking free of the Earth's orbit and they're going more and more to the moon in a commercial sense now. And so SpaceX is going to send their big Falcon rocket to the moon in 2022 as well. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This was one of our student experiments coming back from the space station. This is the Canadian robot ark, and I just let go of the Dragon. This is the Dragon burning through the atmosphere, coming back to Earth, and it had the student experiments on it along with a bunch of other stuff. The astronaut actually took the picture out the window. I love the thin band of the Earth's atmosphere here and the stars. So I just show this picture whenever I can because I find it to be really inspirational. And if I were a 16-year-old looking at that, imagining that's my work on that, man, I would have just melted at that time if that had happened to me. So, okay, so 2024. So NASA has contracted Blue Origin, that's Jeff Bezos' company, and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed to send a lander to the moon. Now this is Jeff Bezos himself talking about the blue moon and his sort of depiction of it. 2024 is when they're saying it's going to go there. That's not that far away either. So what I really would like you guys to think about at this point is leveraging Singapore's position as a global financial hub. The Astroscale and Spire have their headquarters here, so the money goes through here. We should take advantage of our strengths. I think Singapore is a very good place to focus on the financing. And then investors really should consider the advantage of being first adopters. So I like to use the example of first automobiles. When automobiles first were invented, they were noisy, unreliable, smoky, they would spark and cause fires. And there was an entire sector that had existed for 10,000 years, horses. You know, humans have used horses for transportation since time immemorial. The horse economy, whatever you want to call it, required stables and food and grooming and all the other stuff that you needed to raise horses. I mean, horses used to cost as much as a house, right? And so there was that whole sector, and then these noisy, annoying cars came into being, which actually scared the horses. So if you had a horse nearby, you actually sometimes were at risk of getting hurt. So at that point, people were super against automobiles. They didn't see the value of getting from here to somewhere else 5 times, 10 times faster. But we now have, everybody's got a car, right? We don't do horses anymore. And computers, right? Everybody's got the computer on your phone right now. But the one thing to think about is tech development is dependent on finance. No matter what you do, whether you need 100,000 or $1 million, you still need financing. And so in terms of astropreneurship, I would say think about where your interests lie, and you can talk to people and come up with ideas. We do have meetups from time to time. We will have one, I think, in a few months. We have been really busy with some product development stuff recently. Talk to people, think about their position, think about where you could contribute your expertise. And again, you find friends who are studying medicine or law or marketing, talk to them and get them to see that this stuff is real, that they can actually come in and network and follow the sector. So we also do the NASA International Space Apps Challenge every year. This was a couple weekends ago with my friend Adam. He and I both used to sit together in Block 79, co-working space. So the thing with this is we've run it now 3 times, and we've had one of our Singapore teams. So each country gets 2 finalists that go to the global finals. And so one of our Singapore teams was a global winner. So there are something like 80-some countries that enter, and each of the 2 finalists from each nation is evaluated. So one of our Singapore teams got to go and watch a NASA launch, which is pretty, and they got passes to get right up front, so that was pretty cool. So hopefully, if you guys just keep an eye out, you can join us next year. It's a lot of fun. The challenges for this, I think, are particularly cool because NASA provide a couple questions that you can answer, and then they provide curated data sets. So they have scientists and engineers go through, say, which of these images or other kinds of data sets would be relevant to addressing this problem. So you could really contextualize the question and look at what kinds of data they provide. And it's real data, because obviously government data is publicly available. It's taxpayers who pay for it, so they don't hide anything. But it's really an interesting thing, because when I go through and I try to explain the different challenges to people, I'm just like looking through going, oh, this is so interesting. These images are great, ocean salinity or wind speeds or any kind of data. They even will do like animal migration. It's really cool. So I'm hoping next year, if you're around, you can join us. If you're not here, it's a global challenge. So wherever you are on planet Earth, there probably is an opportunity to run the challenge and to participate. If they're not running it, you can just do it yourself. You can apply, and if you have any questions, just ask me. So these are our workshops coming up on the 2nd on Saturday. There's a barcode there if you want to scan it in. So we're doing a hands-on CubeSat workshop with this, where we talk about space systems, and we talk about basically what it takes to put this together and provide an overview. Take this apart, just got some screws on it, put it together, plug it into your laptop, bring a laptop if you're gonna come, plug it into your laptop, and then you can run some code to do a launch simulation. And the whole point here is you're holding a satellite, you're running it through your own laptop, it's doable. That's the whole point of this 3-hour effort, is to make it clear to you that everybody can access this stuff. Like rocket science has this veil of mystery and difficulty. It's doable. And I think you guys are a lot less scared of space tech than everybody else, right? So you're much more comfortable with it, but you can run it through your own laptop. Think about how doable this all is. So the other thing is the Astropreneurship thing that I was talking about earlier, that website we're gonna go through, and we're gonna do some case studies on what works and what doesn't work with startups. That's this afternoon on Saturday. So think about that. So we've got some student discounts. I set up a special code for you guys. If you want to you can have 2 people come for 199 cents too. That's the code, 199, and then 1 person is 132. So if you want to do that, you can set that up for you as well. Yeah, so come ask me if you have any questions afterwards. So that's kind of it, and I know I've taken up some of your time, so thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have. And also, please, help yourselves to the rest of the Mars chocolates. Happy Halloween. Thank you. So, yeah, so questions, thoughts, ideas?
In that Spire and Japanese company, which one was selling a data company?
Spire.
Spire.
Yes.
So, you know how are they generating any money from space mitigation?
Space mitigation or astroscale is the one that's doing space debris mitigation.
Okay.
And I don't think they have anything in space to generate money from at this point, they're just burning. But in terms of, that's an interesting question about money. I think the only company that made money only for a short while was SpaceX with their launches, but you know, like Planet with all the winners, nobody has really made a lot of money. And that's the trick, is getting investors to recognize this is really the next big thing, but you're not gonna get a return in 12 months like you would with some software app, right? It's just not gonna happen. But it's a real thing, so that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, I wonder because I wrote a paper in space mitigation before and published in IAC Bangalore. So I wonder, it was very difficult to make any money because that's why many companies are afraid to enter the space mitigation, even though it's the biggest issue in space industry. In future, gets less employment now. But this company looks very unique. Are they making any money from it?
Not as far as I can tell. Like, they don't always disclose this stuff, but
Yeah.
they haven't really sent anything up to like collect, to sell, they haven't sent anything sellable up.
The ESA launched a hand, right, to collect something.
A tech demonstration one?
Yeah, I think
I don't know, we'd have to look, probably, I mean, it's entirely, they have to dock, right, already in space, so we know how to use cameras to sort of, for the space station to dock, so the next step would be finding somebody in space. The problem with debris, though, is it's tumbling, you know,
Yeah.
and it's random orientation, random speed, so you know that you can do the orbital mechanics for that space station, and you know exactly where it's going, and you can come meet it and dock with it. And that's challenging in enough, but when you've got some kind of crazy piece of debris tumbling, first of all, you have to match your movement to theirs so there's a relative zero velocity between the two of you, and then you have to be able to grab it. So just that mimicking process, I think it would be AI, but I think space debris mitigation, my guess is the insurance companies will be the ones that really end up caring, and they won't care until somebody bumps into somebody else and something bad happens. I think SpaceX had a collision at some
Do
point.
you think this SpaceX is planning to send 60,000 satellites Starlink, right? So they said they will refresh in 5 years. Is that practical? What's your opinion?
You mean replacing them?
Yeah.
If they deorbit them properly, then that should be doable. So what they do is they send these things up with material that will combust fully upon re-entry. So whatever your maximum temperature is when you're coming through the atmosphere, everything has to combust. So some of these rare metals don't, so those you can't use anymore. Or people have agreed not to use them, because remember the issue with space law is it's global, and people can do what they want to do. There's really no way to enforce it. It's like Antarctica, right? Everybody owns it, nobody owns it, but you can do research there. So, but I think the insurance companies, once they have some kind of a big issue with something they've insured and they lose a lot, they realize that somebody's got to figure out this debris problem. Yeah. Any more questions?
I'm really inspired by the shift towards the moon and then Mars. In this part of the world, it's quite hard to justify ventures that look into much further ahead, moon and Mars.
People say that, yeah. I mean, but look, space blankets, you know, like those Mylar blankets that everybody uses now for rescue. You've seen the pictures of refugees, right, wearing these blankets around. Those were developed to keep the electronics at constant temperature on spacecraft. But somebody decided, who was probably not a scientist or engineer, probably a doctor, rescue worker, saying, these are great, they're inexpensive, lightweight, let's start using them on Earth. So, you know, right then and there, you've saved the lives of countless people. I always say that if I tell you to go and like, okay, go sit down and develop, I don't know, some kind of tech for me, you'll do it, you'll do a good job. But if I say it's going up on a rocket, you better have it ready, it just gives people a whole level of inspiration that they don't have otherwise. And it just sort of strikes at humanity, right? I mean, because we don't look up at the sky and see it as a blank space. We know that there's stuff up there, there's, you know, not just the celestial bodies, but spacecraft. And, you know, you will look up and you think of it very differently. So there's something about space that inspires everyone. I mean, even like your 5-year-olds get excited. You know, they all want to be an astronaut, right? I mean, I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. I don't know how many of you guys wanted to be an astronaut, right? So, but it really drives people to innovate and come up with new solutions to problems. And, you know, and then if you have people on Earth participating, then you can rapidly incorporate and integrate that tech into everyday life here on Earth, just like with our phones. But, you know, my favorite topic right now is asteroid mining. I just think it's so cool.
Where's the 700 quintillion? Not that what's it called? Diagram that you showed. There was a particular from the Merrill Lynch. There's a particular figure 700 quintillion on asteroid mining. Jupiter and Mars, the asteroid belt. The bottom right corner.
So that's actually a realistic number. Quintillion, that's trillion with 6 more zeros, right? Trillion, quadrillion, quintillion. They say the world's first trillionaire will be somebody who wins and does asteroid mining. So when we look up at asteroids, we can do spectroscopy. We know what they're made of. We know the size, and we know the current market value of palladium or copper or whatever. You simply do the math. You know how many are up there that you can sort of track. Right, so you know the volume of, you know, copper, volume of molybdenum, whatever's up there, add it up. That's what you get. So that's just the number of asteroids. We know what they're made of. We know how many there are, more or less. So that's sort of a number that people threw out there. I mean, you know, we're waving hands, and the stock market could just crash. But I think you could, you know, maybe remove 1 or 2 zeros, but that's still a mind-blowingly high, incredible number. Yeah.
It's a bit off topic, but down on the left there's like the chance for Carrington level solar storm.
Yes.
Would you say this is realistic? So this number 1 in 8 for the 2020s?
So it's a very intense solar storm that actually knocks out electronics. I would have to look that up. If it's in a Merrill Lynch report, it's probably been vetted. So I'm not going to disagree with it without doing research, but usually they don't publish these things without having actually studied them. So what you do is you look at solar cycles, you look at the number of storms that are out there, and I think the reason that it becomes 1 in 8 is just because we'll have more spacecraft up there, you know? So these solar flares, the coronal mass ejections still keep coming your way, but if there's nobody to be impacted, then that number stays low. But if you've increased your number of satellites up there by 10,000, factor of 10,000, then your odds just necessarily become higher of getting hit, just like space debris. The chances of getting hit are much higher when you have more spacecraft just exposed. Yeah.
I'm curious what the winning idea for the SpaceX challenge was.
Yeah, that one. So they decided they wanted to monitor radiation levels in the upper atmosphere for flight attendants and pilots, which is actually interesting because they are exposed much more to cosmic rays than we are. And so they basically said that they would develop, like you as a flight attendant or a pilot would have an app, and you would have some kind of just like a badge that would measure your effects and then tell you in sort of an accessible way how much radiation you had, what that put you at risks for. So it's a common, you know, it's a very real need. I mean, you think about how much radiation we get. Isn't it the equivalent of, like, if you fly from here to Tokyo, you get the equivalent of 7 X-rays or something, you know? So it's a lot, right? And they're constantly flying. I would also be curious to see just like the rate of miscarriage of flight attendants. Like, it's probably higher than the average population because they're up there all the time. But anyway, so That was the idea, was to create an app. And, so when you're 40,000 feet up, you know, what's your radiation exposure, just measure that cumulatively with an app. That was cool.
Is SpaceX considered a startup?
They will call it a startup. I don't know, if you have $1 billion valuation, I would not call you a startup. But there's startups, and then there's NewSpace and Astropreneurship. So you have the old governments that do the government space, and then NewSpace is the commercial side growing disruptively. The old companies that had the, like Intelsat or whoever, that had the communication satellites, they're not NewSpace. They did things old and expensively, and you know, 300 million for a satellite kind of thing. GPS, that's them. That's not what we're talking about. So NewSpace, this disruptive way, that is the way SpaceX thinks, but that's also the way you guys think. So, yeah, so I don't know, you can call them what you want, you know, it's kind of like a dwarf planet versus a planet. You can give it whatever name you want, that doesn't change what it is.